Hello, this is Sophy Ridge at Westminster with this Sky News Daily. It's been quite the day here at the start of quite the week. George Galloway, the new MP, the newest MP in Parliament for the first time. We've seen the Rwanda bill hitting some sticky areas in the House of Lords. Plus, if you've been living under a rock for the last few days, it's the beginning of budget week. Jeremy Hunt's second and possibly final spring budget. There's definitely an election in the air as all eyes are on what that is going to be. So, a budget to save the Conservative Party rather than save the economy is one assessment, which is probably why so much of the budget noise is around tax cuts. Will it be national insurance? Will it be income tax? How much will it be? And what will be the cost to public services? And also on the podcast today, we are going to be exploring this question. Are tax cuts the holy grail to win over votes? Or actually, is their potency a bit over-egged? Well, we're joined, I'm very pleased to say, by Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor, and also Scarlett Maguire, who is the Director of JL Partners Pollsters. Great to have you both here. It's always that horrible time, isn't it, a couple of days before a budget when we feel like we have a bit of an idea about what it's going to be, but we don't want to put our eggs all in one basket just in case they end up on our face in a couple of days' time when actually our predictions are completely wrong. So I thought I'd start with Sam, who's used to making predictions all the time, some of which more successful than others, but you've got a decent track record, haven't you, Sam? What is your prediction then? Income tax, national insurance?
There's an interesting trend with budgets that actually they've been more and more open about how they work and, you know, the amount of money that the chancellor has got to play with. 5 years ago, we didn't have anything like the level of detail that we do about this budget. And while there'll be some rabbits, I'm sure, some things that they've held back. So we know that at the start of this process, the chancellor thought he had around £30 billion to play with in this budget. And every week he gets updates on how much that money is changing, and it's gone down dramatically. It's now somewhere just shy of £13 billion. Now, listeners might wonder, what is that £13 billion? Well, chancellors set themselves self-imposed constraints on the amount that they can borrow, and Jeremy Hunt's rules, fiscal rules as they're known, mean that he has to ensure that net debt as a proportion of GDP is declining in 5 years' time. In other words, the amount of money he needs to borrow in 5 years' time must be going down, and you can calculate what that means. And it means he's got a buffer, and he can spend that buffer up to about £6-7 billion. So he has £13 billion of headroom. He can't go below £6-7 billion of headroom. Does that mean he's only got £7 billion to play with in this budget? No, because what they're going to do is raise some money through a series of minor tax increases. And also, they're going to play a little trick on us all. They're going to cut the theoretical future amount of public spending over the next few years. At the moment, public spending is due to grow at 1% above inflation. That could be reduced to something like 0.75%, and that will generate £5-6 billion, which will kind of give you the money for the 2p national insurance cut. We know all of that because we're getting a lot of clues, and you can see it around in the newspapers, and that's a bit different to how it has been before.
OK, we've got one prediction from you. I'm quite happy with that one, I have to say.
You want more?
I'll give you more. We'll have lots more as the pod goes on. You've touched on something which does actually really irritate me, though, these kind of fantasy public spending plans. I mean, they're already completely ridiculous, let's be honest. They're so tight that you can't imagine anyone being able to stick to them after the election, even though Labour and the Conservatives are still playing this kind of weird dance, pretending that they maybe are in any way achievable. So we have these kind of already crazy tightened public spending projections, and yet they're still talking about tax cuts now. Scarlett, tax cuts have historically been a people pleaser. And of course, what's not to like about a tax cut, right? Get more money in your pocket at the end of each paycheck. But do you think they are as popular now as I guess some of the Conservative Party would like to think?
I think it's quite a complicated picture, and I think they're more popular to some people than they are to others. I think the first thing to say is that we've got a sort of indication about how popular they are because they did already announce a 2% national insurance cut, and they got no credit for it in the polls whatsoever. The polls remain sort of completely static. In fact, if anything, things have got worse for the Conservatives. We saw that with some new polling out today that showed them on sort of just 20% of the vote, which is really, really sort of existential territory for them. But I do think it's interesting when you ask people would they prefer tax cuts for them or more spending on public services. They do say by about a 2-to-1 margin spending on public services. I think there's a couple of things to note here. The first is that that's quite different for a couple of groups of voters, which I think the Conservatives will particularly have their eyes on at the moment. So the first is those who are saying they're going to vote reform. They would prefer tax cuts. And the second is this group that they really are desperate to win back, which are probably their easiest ones to win back, which are the people who are currently saying they don't like what the government's doing, they're dissatisfied with it, but do not want a Labour government. So they're very unlikely to switch to Labour. I think the other thing I would say about that sort of first statistic about people favouring public spending over tax cuts. I think there's a little bit of performativity there. I think people feel like they're obliged, especially when you see some of these questions, they're phrased like, would you like more money for schools and hospitals, or in your own pay bracket? And people say, yeah, exactly. They want to say schools and hospitals. But I think you get a sort of slightly better pictures. I think, first of all, I think people always slightly imagine that they will be sort of fairer tax cuts on people who are richer than them. People don't think, I think, necessarily, because no one's feeling particularly well off, that it will happen for them. You get a sense of that when you start looking into how fair or unfair people think certain taxes are. Interestingly, even any sort of tax on people who earn less than 50,000, people actually are sort of split on whether that's even fair. So good luck trying to raise any of that for public spending either. I think some of that appetite is sort of, if people say, oh no, there's an appetite actually amongst the public for increased taxation to fund public services, not quite sure that's true either. But I think the final thing is that people are very nervous about public spending cuts. So especially you get this from focus groups, but people are very upset about the state of the country. Everyone seems to have their own story about a part of it not working for them, especially around the NHS. And so I think if they hear anything which they think is less money going to these sorts of things, that will worry quite a lot of people.
Really interesting to hear you talking about how, on the whole, people are very worried about the state of public services, which I guess chimes with what you get in focus groups and everything as well. But actually that there are these key groups of voters that the Conservatives really need to shore up ahead of the next election. And it is important, isn't it, to view this whole budget through the lens of that election. I mean, it could be the last budget before an election, maybe. There might be another one, who knows? But I guess it's all gearing up to it, isn't it?
I mean, it'll be pivotal whether it's the last one or not for it. Scarlett is so right to highlight the kind of difference in views between the population as a whole and key voter groups. We've been looking at exactly the same thing through an ever so slightly different prism with the voters panel, which Sky's running at the moment. We're looking at Conservative 2019 voters, some of whom will vote Tory, some of whom won't, will go Reform, some of whom aren't sure, which is not a dissimilar group. And we haven't forced them to choose between tax cuts and spending cuts or rises. The sheer number of them that put tax cuts quite high up. And so if your question was about looking this through the prism of an election, I think two things come to the fore. First of all, this group is different to other voters. And secondly, if a chancellor stands up in a budget just before an election and says, I'm cutting taxes, people can see that happening and the consequences of that, they can notice that pretty much immediately. If a chancellor stands up and says, well, over the next 5 years, I'm going to spend more on public services, the chances are that between that moment of the words coming out of the chancellor's mouth and the moment and the day that the voter goes to the ballot box, they won't see the consequences of that. And that's the kind of raw electoral politics that's at play, I think, in this budget.
Look, as you said, the polling for the Conservatives is pretty existential at the minute. It's pretty bad. And they're going to be looking at how many levers they'll have to pull to try and change that between now and polling day. And I guess a budget is one of them. Do you think it could actually make much difference?
No, not particularly. I mean, we've had lots of things that are meant to be these big events that will shift the polls. So a conference, King's Speech, budget, autumn statement rather. None of them have moved things at all. In fact, if anything, as I said before, I think things are getting worse. There's a couple of things. I think public have stopped listening. So everyone, if you mention a government announcement, quite a lot of people will roll their eyes. It's sort of exhaustion, actually, of announcements and resets and changes, whilst this, fundamental sense that they're not actually able to sort of govern with the basics, right? That's something that we hear a lot. Then the sort of other thing to say about it is that actually a lot of this stuff doesn't have cut through. From my experience anyway, the public are sort of less aware of day-to-day things and announcements and things like this than people think they are, but also much more astute than people think they are. And when we were talking to voters about the national insurance cut that we saw in the autumn, a lot of people were saying, okay, a couple of things. Firstly, this barely touches the sides. My bills have gone up by so much more than I'm getting back here, but fine. And then the secondly is they're just doing it to buy my vote anyway, aren't they? And you could say, well, maybe they'll take that and vote for them. But there is actually a real, even if people are quite tuned out from the news cycle, people are very sceptical about politicians and their motives. And I think especially now with this government. And so
the bait and cynicism in the voters panel.
Exactly.
I mean, they absolutely know. They've pre-adjusted their expectations knowing that it's election year. Yeah. And that just makes it incredibly hard for anybody whose party's been in power for 14 years.
That's exactly it. And then I think then you add this thing on top of it, which is something that we have seen from the Prime Minister before, which is this sense that saying, no, the economy is getting better. They're not so much able to say that after they sort of went into recession. But, the economy is getting better and we're giving you these tax cuts. And then we've heard I think people feel slightly sort of gaslit by that, saying, well, you can't just give us a tax cut and expect us to stop complaining about things because I'm still feeling worse off than I did a few years ago. So I think there's actually also a danger for them if they sound too happy about it. But, we'll see.
And I guess particularly if people feel that it's tax cuts for well-off people at a time when they're not giving money for public services that they're really worried about. How closely is Labour going to be watching this? Because it's going to impact on them, isn't it? They're going to be drawing up the plans, spending plans the years ahead. If there's tax cuts, then Labour has to decide whether they're going to reverse them or keep them if they do win the next election.
Oh, Labour are totally on it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's that easy for them. The first line of most of their responses will be the same as the first line of the responses to the autumn statement, which is, yes, he may have given you tax cuts, the Chancellor may have given you a reduction to national insurance or whatever, but do you feel better or worse off after 14 years of a Conservative-led government? And that, they think, is a winning line. And to a certain extent, it might be, because, of course, one of the things that's happening is as they potentially, restore more of your pay packet through a reduction in national insurance, the change in income tax thresholds means that the actual picture, as people get dragged into higher and higher tax brackets, is much more complicated than that. And in our voters panel, people know that. But your question was about Labour. This is a pre-election budget, so of course, Jeremy Hunt will be laying traps for Labour. And one of them that's pretty widely identified is they're going to abolish the non-dom system or massively curtail it, which will generate £2 or £3 billion, which can go into tax cuts. But Labour were already going to do that and have already announced many, many, many plans of
how to spend that money.
There's a big desire in the Conservative Party to shift the debate about how Labour's going to fund things and spend things in an environment that actually, to be completely fair, Rachel Reeves has shut down differences between Labour and Tory spending plans in everything but a tiny, tiny number of almost just simply symbolic spending areas. You've got the private school tax breaks that are being removed. You've got something called carried interest, which helps some financiers. That might go, but, again, that might go in the budget to remove another bit of spending. So they want to get the debate onto how is Labour going to pay for stuff? Will it be by raising taxes? I actually think the challenge for Labour is almost on the other end of the spectrum. Labour have become so desperate to mirror everything that the Conservatives are doing, and, for instance, would, I think, purport to take those public spending plans, if they are cut, more seriously than I suspect they would those in the Tory party would if they won the election. That you end up with a Labour Party struggling to do that thing that does tickle their core vote, which is offer what they would characterise as hope, greater spending and a little bit of optimism, that the sort of that sense of public sector austerity, and it's not a clean picture.
I'm really fascinated by Labour at this moment. Obviously, they're going to come into more scrutiny because we expect them to be in government potentially by the end of the year, right? And it feels to me like they are so nervous about getting there still that they, as Sam was saying, they just want to mirror almost everything that the Conservatives are doing, and effectively just saying, we'll basically do the same thing just more competently, so vote for us. Does the polling suggest that is a good idea, that they're trying to, I guess, cut off any suggestion that the magic money tree is going to be back and you can't trust a Labour government, which is what the Conservatives are doing? Or actually, do you think there is a bit more space for them to lay out a different path than the common government?
In a way, it's sort of difficult for me to sit here and say it's not working for them, because they're still, they're still on leads of sort of 20 points. Sometimes, some places have them as more. And again, nothing much has dented that. They also, most people have them clearly leading on who'd be best to handle the economy, whether it's their, combination of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves seen as preferable to Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt. And all these metrics, they have sort of neutralised these areas that voters were historically concerned about Labour handling, specifically the economy and immigration. So in that sense, yes, they've sort of been able able, I guess, to do that and to allay people's fears and make them seem safe after Jeremy Corbyn in 2019. I think there is a different thing, though, and this is more of a longer term point, I think, again, for sort of trust in politics and politicians generally. And I think that goes back to the point about voters being sceptical and also quite astute. Like, I think people get a sense of when politicians are triangulating, and actually something you hear in focus groups quite a lot, which is always funny if you're sitting in them, is saying the problem with politicians these days is they're listening to too many focus groups, and that will come up in a focus group and you sort of think, well, yeah, probably you might be right. But I think there is a real sense that, and we got this around the 28 billion, and again, even though that sort of U-turn didn't damage their standing in the headline polls, I think it did actually, it reinforced people's sense that all politicians are sort of the same in that they will say one thing and then do another, and they don't have much qualms about doing that, and they're doing it all to get your vote. And I think that's something that's a little bit more pernicious, can be quite destructive long term. I mean, Rochdale was incredibly unique with a very, unusual constituency and even more unusual set of circumstances. But I think there's a sort of warning there about sort of anti-politics, even if you can't read on it in that big a level, even if it means the Labour will still get a majority, potentially a very big majority. There are warning signs there about the British public's relationship with politicians and democracy that I think you actually do without wanting to sound too overblown, which that sort of thing I think can undermine.
I couldn't agree more. The story of the Labour abandonment of the 28 billion spending on green investment was not a story of a change in the relationship between voters and the Labour Party, because clearly that didn't happen. It was a story about my understanding of what the hell is going on inside the Labour Party, because at its heart, what was going on was Labour had spent months and months and months with the leader defending that policy and that figure on the telly when they never actually intended to spend. They didn't know how they were going to spend that money. They hadn't worked out £28 billion of spending a year. It was a fiction. Yet they were, basically using up political credits, defending this thing that they didn't know how to spend the money of because they were sort of too scared and not good enough to get off the hook of it. And they weren't internally agile enough, and they were all rowing amongst themselves about how to do it. And so that is a warning symbol for, if Labour win the election, they've got to improve how they make decisions, how they communicate what they're doing, and understand that the job of winning over the electorate doesn't stop the day after polling day.
Right, Sam. You're Mr. Prediction, right? You make them each week in Politics at Jack and Sam podcast. Any other predictions you want to stick your neck out here and give us ahead of next week?
Well, you don't ask if you don't get, Sophie, so here are a few more. I think the 5p a litre fuel duty cut, which was due to expire later this month, will be rolled over. At least an astronomical amount of money. That will probably be the second biggest amount of money that the Chancellor spends after the tax cut. But that'll be rolled over to Cheers in the Sun. I think there'll be a British ISA to spur investment. They'll change the rules around pension funds, basically making funds disclose how much British investment they're doing. Every change to pension fund rules worries me. There's such large amounts of money. Be careful what you tinker with. They're not going to please business by changing VAT thresholds. They're not going to help families who would lose out, if they're earning between 50,000 and 60,000 and have kids. The withdrawal rate of child benefit means they pay an enormously complicated marginal rate, a high marginal rate of tax. They're not going to tackle that. It's lower down the priority list than tax cuts, despite that being in the budget at one point. And that's enough. Will that do? Am I let off the hook?
That'll do.
It's quite a lot.
You got any, Scarlett?
No, absolutely not.
Do you know what my prediction is? My prediction is that after the budget, we're going to know when the election's going to be. Yeah, because I think it's going to be our first proper clue. If they're going to do a May election, if they're going to go early and do a May election, it's going to have to be a big feel-good budget. And if it's not, then I think we will then get perhaps the best sense that we can ever hope to have that it's going to be a longer time.
So I'm going to play this back to you on the evening of the budget, Sophie, to find out what the answer to the question is that you've just boldly predicted.
Can you do the day after the budget? I need 24 hours to. I'm going to be on air all day during the budget, so I'm not going to have any time for big picture thoughts. Okay. The day after the budget, I will rise to that challenge. Deal?
World's tiniest violin for how much you've got to work, but yes, deal. Thursday night, I'll ask you the question.
Okay, deal. Well, you've been listening to the Sky News Daily. Neil Patterson will be back on the next episode and also covering Budget Day on Wednesday. Plus, if you haven't heard, Sky has a brand new politics podcast, Electoral Dysfunction. I can't believe I'm having to say that on air. I'm not as cool as Beth about these things. It's with our political editor Beth Rigby, the Labour MP Jess Phillips, and the Conservative peer Ruth Davidson. You can listen now wherever you found this one. Thank you very much to Sam. Thank you very much to Scarlett, and thank you to listening.